Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Sarah here. I'm in our BBC studio in Washington.
And it's Anthony. I'm sitting next to Sarah here in Washington, D.C.
And it is Mariana, aka Misinformation, in the worldwide headquarters in London.
Now, we're going to focus on the Democrats in this episode because there really is a lot to talk about how they're going to try and reshape themselves and their message after the really, frankly, humiliating defeat that they suffered at the hands of Donald Trump and his Republican Party. But while we're talking about the Democrats, there is one other thing that we cannot ignore because it's making really big news here in the States this week, and that is Joe Biden's pardon of his son, Hunter. It was a controversial thing to do because he had said all along that he absolutely would not. 10 times in public he said that he had no intention of pardoning Hunter Biden. In fact, he sounded quite indignant when people asked him about the possibility. Then he went and did it this week, and I think it's going to have real consequences for the party. I think it was a mistake, at least in how he phrased it, Anthony, saying that he was doing this because he thought the justice system had been politicized, that raw politics had infected the prosecution against Hunter, who'd been singled out unfairly. Because that sounds an awful lot like the argument that Donald Trump uses when he says he was politically targeted. Do you think it was a dangerous politically thing for Biden to have done?
Well, I don't think Biden has to worry about politics anymore. So, probably not dangerous for him. He didn't have to make any kind of explanation for why he was pardoning his son. He could have just said, I'm pardoning him, or not said anything at all and just done the pardon. I think you're right. I think when he comes out and explains it in a way that sounds awfully like Donald Trump and the lawfare politics of prosecutions kind of an explanation, it makes a lot of Democrats uncomfortable because that's the way they were attacking Donald Trump for several years. Now, mind you, those attacks didn't work. Donald Trump pardoned a ton of people for very clearly political motives when he left office in 2021, and no one seemed to care. So I don't think people are going to care about this when we get months, years down the line. It's just going to get washed away with Joe Biden's political legacy. But for the moment, it is a distraction for Democrats. It also, I think, gives Democrats not named Joe Biden a chance to really go after Joe Biden and take out their frustrations on him. They blame him for this electoral defeat. They want to be able to get some distance from him. And this is a great opportunity for a lot of these Democrats to say, oh, Joe Biden, this was so dumb. We need to be better than that, and then paint themselves as the better alternative.
Yeah, and it has been noticeable how many Democrats have been prepared to stick the boot in. Jared Polis, the governor in Colorado, you've had Gavin Newsom criticizing him quite heavily. You'd expect Republicans to do it, but there have been a lot of Democrats who have said that they think it hands ammunition to the Republicans. Because I agree with you, Anthony. I don't think the fact that it looks, distasteful or slightly seedy to be pardoning a member of your own family, that looks like an abuse of power, that'll be forgotten in the midst of time. It's going to be a long time before we forget that Donald Trump was indicted in 4 different criminal cases, and in every one he said, they're attacking me politically, I haven't actually done anything wrong. And now Joe Biden has said, well, yeah, that is the way the Justice Department operates. That's how they operated when they were dealing with my son, Hunter. It feels like it just undercuts everything that the Democrats have been saying in relation to whether or not, Donald Trump is a felon, is a criminal.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you were saying there, Sarah, about, Democrats who've decided to sort of actually have a bit of a go at Joe Biden and who aren't happy about the way that he's presented this. Because that does still contrast with some of the people on social media. So if you spend any time on X or TikTok, I've been looking at my undercover voters, the fictional characters with their social media accounts. I've been looking at their feeds, and the left-leaning voters, a lot of their feeds are dominated by people who are kind of agreeing with Joe Biden and repeating this rhetoric about the justice system being politicized and saying, other people are going to be targeted by Donald Trump, and it's really important that these kinds of pardons are issued and so on and so forth. And I think it just tells you a lot about how a certain type of language, one that Donald Trump perhaps was the most used to using, has become pretty widespread in American politics. Like, people kind of think it's an okay thing to say and to talk about, like this constant kind of, it's politicized, I'm being unfairly targeted, none of it's fair anymore. It's worth saying as well that Donald Trump has done a little bit more since we last chatted about this. So in a filing on Monday, Trump's lawyers said President Biden argued that raw politics has infected this process and it led to a miscarriage of justice. These comments amounted to an extraordinary condemnation of President Biden's own Department of Justice. So kind of weaponizing that against him, I guess, going forward. I mean, what does that actually mean? What will he use that to do you think?
Well, that filing in relation to the hush money case is saying they want the entire case thrown out and the verdict, because of course Donald Trump was found guilty of illegally covering up those hush money payments. They want the verdict vacated, basically completely overturned. He would be declared not guilty. It would be as though the court case had never ever happened. Now, that's unlikely to ever happen. We know he's not going to be sentenced for that crime before he takes office, and he may or may not be sentenced in 2029 when he leaves office. But it shows you how Trump and the Republicans will leap on this and say, look, Biden said it out of his own mouth, that it's a politicized justice system, and that's what we were the victims of.
Yeah, and of all the cases against Donald Trump, it was the hush money case that looks the most like kind of still, targeting him, particularly because of who he was for prosecution. Because like the Hunter Biden case, this was one that was an old crime that was dusted off and prosecuted later. This was a kind of a novel interpretation of laws and applying it to Donald Trump in a way that really hadn't been done a whole lot before, charging him in a state court for covering up a federal campaign finance violation. So, the other cases, it's a little harder to say, well, this was just because Donald Trump is Donald Trump. I mean, the ones about January 6th and overturning the election results, pretty clearly, there was an alleged crime there that was bigger than just him being who he was. But, I mean, we'll see. I don't think they're going to get this case thrown out as much as they would like to. But I think we are seeing Democrats perfectly happy to lob some hand grenades at Joe Biden. But I think Marianne has a good point also, and that is that rank and file Democrats, some of the ones who are posting on social media, and probably the ones just out there in the country, they aren't going to get too worked up over this. Democratic politicians are, but Democratic voters, there are a lot of them who are like, oh, we've been playing by different rules than the Republicans and Donald Trump for years now. It's about damn time that Joe Biden flexes his muscles a little bit and protects his own, and they're not going to really hold that against him.
Those hand grenades that you say that some Democrats are lobbing at Joe Biden, they can't reach him, of course, because the minute he did this, he leapt on a plane and went off on an official trip to Angola, the first US president to visit that country. And he's been dodging questions from press and reporters who are following him around on that trip. So he left it to his poor beleaguered press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, to answer questions about this. And she's the one who has had repeatedly through the course of this year had to stand up in the briefing room and tell reporters that he was definitely not going to pardon Hunter Biden.
You have said repeatedly yourself since the election, the president has said for months, no pardon was coming. I wanted to ask you, could those statements now be seen as lies from the American people? Is there really a credibility issue here given now this announcement?
First of all, one of the things that the president always believes is to be truthful to the American people. That is something that he always truly believes. And if you see the end of his, I assume that you've read his statement, and you look at the end of that statement, and he actually says that in the first line in the last paragraph, and respects the thinking and how the American people will actually see this in his decision making.
It's interesting in terms of the defense of this, I guess, from the White House and from Joe Biden's sort of wider team. If you put aside the rhetoric around the kind of politicized justice system, which a lot of people have taken issue with, do you think there's any part of the American public that kind of understand Joe Biden's decision making in so much as this is his son, and he's clearly had both his son and himself have clearly had a lot of really horrible stuff happen to them throughout their lives. So do you think on any level, kind of on a human level, anyone understands it in that way? Or do you think actually everyone's like, why has he done this?
I think a lot of people understand it. The president has this power. He's protecting his son. He very clearly cares about his family. His son is a former drug addict who was going through all of these crimes while he was under the influence of crack cocaine. And Joe Biden wants to try to keep him from spiraling back down into that black hole that he crawled out of. Now, I think Republicans would say, no, this is actually Democrats and the Biden family covering up their crimes. And if you look at the pardon, it covers 2014 to this last Sunday, any possible crime against the U.S. government that Hunter Biden may have committed over that period of time. And they'll say, look, we've always thought there was more to it than this. His China dealings, his Ukraine dealings, they took place while Joe Biden was vice president, and Joe Biden was vice president from 2014 to 2016. This is really covering up all that. So I think you're going to see the partisan divide sides play out here. And it's something that I think Biden, by the breadth of this pardon, probably contributes to.
And I think anyone can understand why, as a father, you would do this. But as a president, when you take that oath of office, are you not swearing to put the country ahead of yourself and your own family and say, I'll act as the president, not just as a dad?
Yeah, absolutely. But when there's no consequences for taking care of your family on your way out the door, we've seen presidents in the past act in very selfish ways as their political career draws to a close, and this is another example of it. And maybe it's hypocritical because Biden liked to talk about how he's defending democratic institutions and upholding the rule of law, and for him to change course now in the final days of his presidency, it's a bad look for him, and it might taint his legacy, as some people have said. But when push comes to shove, he probably didn't care. His family was always the most important thing to him, and he's going to take care of it on his way out.
Well, and that's why you've got Democrats like California Governor Gavin Newsom saying, with everything the president and his family have been through, I completely understand the instinct to protect Hunter, but I took the president at his word. So by definition, I'm disappointed and I can't support this decision. So he's saying that, he's disappointed that basically the president was lying about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Democrats are going to, rightfully say they stuck their neck out. I mean, poor Karine Jean-Pierre, as press secretary is one of the toughest jobs in Washington, and she just had to sit there and take it from the press corps because she was the one standing up there, sticking up for Joe Biden, and saying that he was being very direct and forthright and saying he wasn't going to pardon his son. And Gavin Newsom, he was in the spin room at all the debates and was out there touting Joe Biden over the course of this year, and now makes him look a little bad, and he wants to try to protect himself. So it's every man and woman for himself at this point, as Joe Biden heads for the exits.
He literally ran away from me in the spin room in Atlanta after that disastrous Biden-Trump debate. He was so sick of people asking him if this meant that Joe Biden was going to drop out of the race, and he was trying to, talk about all the things that Biden had argued well during the course of the debate, and nobody was listening to him. They were just saying, it shows he's too old, it shows he's got to drop out. And just as I was about to put a question from him, he turned on his heels and he ran away from all of us. So, I think he might have been sick of defending Biden at that point. And that was months and months ago.
And it's interesting, that desire, I guess, right now for some of these Democrats to distance themselves from Joe Biden, aside from this kind of obvious example of the Hunter Biden pardon and what that means, but kind of more generally, perhaps because Kamala Harris broadly is seen as not managing to do that, and that seems to have kind of impacted her chances during the election. Do you think that there's the same desire for some of these people to distance themselves from Kamala Harris as well because of what happened in the end? Or, because it does feel like such a shift. It felt like there was this, people obviously trying to generate this level of enthusiasm, in October and in the months leading up to the election around her. And now it's sort of like crickets and silence. Like, is she seen as, for want of a better word, sort of toxic as Joe Biden by the Democrats?
I don't know about toxic, but definitely there's the taint of defeat on her, which is typical. If you lose a presidential race, you usually disappear into the scenery afterwards. Donald Trump being the one exception, and he, of course, never admitted that he was defeated, even though he lost that 2020 election by about the same margin that Kamala Harris lost to him in November. So I guess she could have said, no, I didn't lose, and keep fighting on and maybe have a better political standing for running in 2028. But I think you may see going forward, if Kamala Harris tries to reassert herself, some of these Democratic rivals knocking her down, because she would still be a formidable opponent running in 2028. They'll have to go through her if they want to win. So I think they're holding their fire because they're not sure what she's going to do. But if she pops back up again, expect some whacks at her the same way we're kind of seeing these whacks at Joe Biden.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic, isn't it? This is what you were getting at, Marianne. I think that if she had, during the course of the campaign, stuck the boot in a little bit harder on Joe Biden and said, yes, he made mistakes during his presidency. Yes, we didn't handle the border as well as we could have done. Yes, our economic policy should have focused more on inflation. I disagreed with him over these things. Then she might have had a better chance of getting elected. But in fact, she was being quite loyal to her boss and worried about hurting his feelings, it looked like. Whereas now, everybody, knives are out for Joe Biden, but it's like a month too late.
We spent an entire half a show talking about this now, and I think it's a big story in the moment. But again, I just don't think this is going to have any kind of legs. And Donald Trump is going to do something. We're going to be talking about something next week that's entirely different. It's not going to come up again.
So, on the nothing burger scale of politics, what's on the plate for this one?
I think that this is a burger that looks very big and juicy and is sitting on the table. But when you take a bite out of it, you realize that you're going to be hungry again in another hour.
Right, so it's not just a few salad leaves, but it's a really
unsatisfying
it's a
not
burger.
filling burger.
Right, let's move on and talk about what the Democrats need to do from here and how they can use the next couple of years to regroup and refocus themselves. There has been plenty said about what's gone wrong, and it really is important now that they start looking ahead to see how they can put it right. But, of course, there's great disagreement over that. I mean, it was reported yesterday that the Hawaii Senator Brian Schatz, who's also a member of the Democratic leadership, that he said anyone who has a grand strategy is full of crap. But he thinks that Democrats need to keep things simple. Now, maybe it's not the most eloquent language, but he probably has summed up what one of the problems for the Democrats is there, that nobody has a grand strategy. They've got to identify the problem first, I think, before you can come up with the solution. And Anthony, to what extent do you think they have identified what went wrong?
Well, I think they understand that they're having issues with working class voters, blue collar voters, and not just white working class, which was Donald Trump's base in 2016, but also Hispanic and some black working class voters. And part of that is a reflection of the economic circumstances this year. And that will, in theory, resolve itself over time, or at the very least, if the public's still angry, they're not going to blame the Democrats for it. They'll blame the Republicans for it. And so I will say almost they don't need a grand strategy right now. Being the opposition that's not in power and criticizing Donald Trump could be their strategy, at least in the short term. It worked for Donald Trump. That was essentially his strategy over the past 2 years, was saying the Democrats have botched it all up, send me back in and I'll fix it. That could be their message until we get to the presidential primary process after the midterm elections, where you're going to have candidates trying to paint a vision for the future, and you're going to get contrasting visions, and you'll have what I think is probably going to be a robust contest for the nomination, and it's the Democratic voters in all these primary states that are going to decide what the party should do going forward.
There are lots of critics and people who would say, I think we even know some of them, who would say that the issue was wokeness, that the Democratic Party had been infected by a woke mind virus, and that they were obsessed with talking about what pronouns people were using, about whether transgender men were competing in women's sports and getting into the dressing rooms, and that they were obsessing over diversity and inclusion at the expense of talking about things that people really cared about. To what extent is that legitimate?
Yeah, Sarah, it's the kind of conversation that has very much dominated the online world since the election, including X, Elon Musk's X. And I think, therefore, it kind of is on the minds of the Democrats, regardless of whether it matters so much or not. Issues that are considered, to quote, woke, and to what extent the Democrats are seen as being, or were seen as being, sort of out of touch with what a lot of people care about. I think some of that comes down to, as we've chatted about quite extensively, like messaging on issues that people care about, like the economy and immigration. But nonetheless, the question of using pronouns, or some of the things that the Democrats have perhaps been associated with, including in attack ads that were targeted at them by Trump's campaign. It will be really interesting to see going forward where that ends up. And you guys might have seen in some conservative or right-leaning media outlets, there were some stories about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democrat, who they were suggesting or alleging that she'd removed the pronouns she, her from her social media account, from X in particular. It's not entirely clear whether she made the decision to do that, whether there are changes to like her profile and that just sort of happened. But I think it is interesting to think of whether someone like her who is considered a left-leaning Democrat and who has been very vocal on kind of progressive issues, whether she also is thinking about how to tailor that messaging in a way that has kind of mass appeal, rather than appealing to a group of people perhaps who are used to doing things like that, like using their pronouns, when there are a lot of Americans who won't be doing that and aren't used to it. I mean, I don't know how much we think that they will change the kind of entire tone of their discussions, the Democrats, off the back of some of those issues you just spoke about, Sarah.
Well, or whether they need to, because although the Republicans did attack them for this a lot, and there was that ad that ran in Pennsylvania extensively saying Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, making a point about the pronouns. She didn't campaign on any of this stuff. She didn't say any woke things. She didn't even make a point about being a female candidate or a black candidate either. And I didn't see or hear coming from the Democrats any of this stuff. It was all from the Republican side saying they're too elitist and they're too woke.
Right. Remember when we were in Chicago, well, we were remarking how transgender issues and even gender issues, full stop, were not really highlighted by any of the speakers at that convention. So I think it's the ghosts of 2019 and 2020 and what Kamala Harris ran on in her failed presidential bid that year that really came back to haunt her. And that may not be something that comes back to haunt the next Democratic presidential nominee. I think it'll certainly be something that Democratic voters will keep in mind when they're picking a candidate in 2028. And if you look at the Democrats who won across the board in congressional elections, they actually did pretty well. They won all the battleground states except Pennsylvania in the Senate races. They picked up a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. We were going to have a very narrow margin in the House of Representatives. It's 220 to 215 with the Republicans in control. And because 3 Republicans have moved on to the Trump administration or in one case just dropped out and disappeared off the face of the earth, it's going to be 217 to 215. So Democrats know how to win elections, and they won elections this year. It was just the top of the ticket where they took it on the chin. And you're right, the top of the ticket, that one ad in Pennsylvania, other swing states, about the they, them, really did hurt. And it probably is not something that Democrats are going to be exposed to the next go-round.
Maybe they'll be better at stamping on it and saying it's Republicans who are obsessed with whether or not transgender boys are playing in girls' sports, and say, look, stop obsessing about the sports team. Don't worry about whether the schools are funded properly, whether the children have got the books to read, and whether they've got enough to eat to be able to learn, and that you're the guys who are obsessed with transgender sports. But yeah, they didn't stamp on it well enough, but it's a mistake, I think, to say that they campaigned on it.
Isn't, though, the issue, kind of to your point, Sarah, that rather than them campaigning on that basis at all, or talking about those issues in that way, it was the ability of Donald Trump's campaign to successfully project the idea that that is what they're about and the perception of them in that way. Like, it's almost like this kind of idea of, I guess, protecting yourselves from that kind of attack going forwards, knowing that that is something that, you know, Elon Musk and a lot of the other people who've been incredibly vocally supportive of Donald Trump have absolutely gone for, you know, issues like identity politics. And that's not to say that the Democrats were even talking about those things, but unfortunately, the discourse around it then eclipsed like other stuff they were talking about. And so you'd imagine that if you're thinking about 2028, you're thinking, well, I want to run in such a way that they kind of can't attack me for this and use it to kind of undermine me and eclipse all the other stuff I want to talk about, like you say, like funding for schools, for example, which they'd perceive as much more important, some of the people who'd be running.
Yeah, and they just need to get back to brass tacks. I think that's what everybody agrees. The question is how you do it, how they craft a message that speaks to the working class of America in a way that they understand. Because, I mean, interestingly, you've now got this situation where the Democrats are so perceived to be the elitist, better off, better educated party that they're going around advocating for higher taxes on themselves to fund services for the less well off. And it's those less well off people who are voting for tax cuts for the rich and cutting the funding for the services that will help them out. So there's a massive disconnect there that the Democrats need to find an entirely different way of talking about.
Isn't there also something about the there's something about the ability to your point, Sarah, to connect with a certain type of American perhaps who they didn't reach this time around. And we've had loads and loads of discussions about the way that Donald Trump's team very successfully harnessed the kind of alternative media or the new media, this idea of targeting fraternities or appearing on certain podcasts. I was interested to hear about this guy, Ben Wickler, who's kind of rising. He's seen as a pretty big deal. He was seen as the mastermind behind Wisconsin managing to flip 14 state legislative seats and to get Senator Tammy Baldwin back to DC as well in November. And he's someone who kind of does have experience of the new media. Like, he wrote headlines at The Onion, the satirical news website. He's kind of worked on podcasts, stuff like that. Like, is there a need for the Democrats to think about how to learn from the way that they relied on the professional or traditional media or whatever we want to call it, and to actually lean into, which to be honest AOC also is good at, lean into the ability to kind of connect with different types of voters where they are, rather than following the sort of rules of engagement, I guess, when it comes to politicians and the media and how that works.
Yeah, I mean, of course you've got to speak to voters where they are, but you've got to have something to say to them as well. And the reason that Ben
true.
Wickler's in the news and that we're all learning about him is because it's possible that he may end up as the chair of the Democratic National Committee. They've got to elect a new one in the new year. And that's quite a behind-the-scenes role, isn't it, Anthony? That's not somebody who's going to be like the party leader out front delivering the message, but it does matter.
It does matter. It's a nuts and bolts, as you mentioned, kind of a role. Someone who's involved in fundraising, someone who's involved in on-the-ground organizing, and building the apparatus that can support in 2026 the midterm congressional election campaign, can help pick good candidates, can help fund the candidates who do win, and then have a turnkey operation that when someone wins the Democratic presidential nomination in 2028, they can use this grassroots support to help turn out people and to win the key battleground states. So I think it is important in that this is the first barometer, the first test that we have coming up to show the direction that the Democrats want to go, and at least the direction that the elite, the party insiders in the Democratic Party think they should go, and it might tell us a little bit about the balance of power within the Democratic Party. But it's not, particularly this time around, these aren't high-profile Democratic politicians who are jumping in to run this. These are people who are kind of behind-the-scenes players. Sometimes you will get a DNC head who will be someone who was prominent and kind of rallies voters and has a higher profile than we've seen in the past, but not in this case.
And that candidate's got to be Rahm Emanuel, who's a really interesting guy, who was in Barack Obama's White House in his first term. He's been the mayor of Chicago. He's currently the ambassador to Japan. His brother is probably the most powerful agent in Hollywood as well, which is quite interesting. The model for the character in the TV show Entourage, called Ari. But Rahm Emanuel, I mean, he's a bit of a bruiser, isn't he? I mean, he looks sleek and elegant, but he's got pretty sharp elbows. He would turn things around a bit if he were to come back and take control of the DNC.
Yeah, and he'd also anger a lot of the progressives. They hate him so much. So that would be something that would sharpen the divides within the Democratic Party. But like in 2005, I think Howard Dean, who had run for president, kind of a proto Bernie Sanders, someone who was rallying the left towards bigger government and more expansive government, and all these issues that they really care about. He ran for DNC chair, and people thought, oh, he's going to change things. He's going to be the face of the party. He really wasn't. I mean, the DNC chair and the Republican Party chair as well, you get pulled into kind of the minutia and fundraising, endless fundraising. It doesn't give you a whole lot of time to get out there and rally the troops the way I think a lot of people think that the head of the party would be.
I wouldn't want to be calling donors on the Democratic side. I mean, they gave so much money, more than's ever been donated to another political campaign in history, and they cannot be happy with how it was spent or what the result was. I mean, they're going to keep those checkbooks closed for a while, I would imagine.
Until Donald Trump says something or does something, and then the money will come rolling in. But yes, I think there's a little donor fatigue right now. They've got time to regroup, and you'll see the machine turn back on again as we get into the Trump administration and people start thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to do whatever I can to stop this man.
That's it for today. If you want to hear more from us, you can listen to all of our episodes on BBC Sounds. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, y'all.
Bye.